Finally, what I'll do before I finish up is just give you a brief overview of the National Homicide Monitoring Program. As I mentioned very briefly at the beginning, it started in 1989. I should mention my nan loves homicide because she just wants to know who's killing who and what's going on. But nevertheless, it started in 1989. Basically, all the police commissioners got together and said, we need someone to collect national data on homicide. And so the AIC was it, and we've been doing it for that period of time now. In effect, the homicide monitoring database is built from a range of sources, most primarily police extracts. So basically we ask each of the police jurisdictions to provide us an extract of their data at the end of every year, and we analyse that data and code it into a database. But we also corroborate that evidence with coronial records that we get from the coroner's service, as well as court transcripts if someone's then taken to court for that offence, and then subsequently any media reports that are either about the court case or anything else that might otherwise go on. We of course treat the media reports with some level of caution, but nevertheless they're a good opportunity to prompt us to look for other information. If the media is saying something but the police report hasn't come through with that, then it gives us that cause for thought in terms of quality control in the data. There's a total of 77 variables, which doesn't sound like much, but it gets quite complicated because if for every homicide you have an incident, where it occurs, when it occurs, how it occurs, those kinds of things. But then you have information on every victim and every offender. So for example, I think it was 35 people died at Port Arthur massacre. I could stand corrected on that. I'm pretty sure it's 35. So for that incident, we have 35 victims and one offender. And for every victim and offender pair, we collect relationship data, so we know to what extent Martin Bryant was related to every one of the people that he killed during that period of time. And of course that's an extreme example, but indeed we do get homicides where a father might kill his intimate partner and his child, and so we collect really kind of finite information about what went on in that. And the current status is that since the beginning of the project in 1989 to June 2008, which is the most recent data that we've got at the moment, there's 5,755 incidents involving 6,165 victims and 6,456 offenders. There are more victims and more offenders than there are incidents because there are multiple victim and multiple offender homicides. And that obviously then complicates, of course, our analysis, but that's life, unfortunately, when it comes to working with complex databases. I'm just going to go through some really basic stuff so that you get a sense of what's really going on with homicide, and then I'll finish up. Homicide rate is at an historical low. In the most recent year that we've been able to get data, it was 1.2 per 100,000 of the Australian population. It was equal to the year before, and it was only 1.2, the same rate 2 years before that, but it's never been as low as that since. We, of course, are always a little bit behind because we rely on the police to get the data to us after the end of the financial year, and then we go through that very comprehensive and long-running process of trying to get the data into the database. But there's a lot of interest about what's going on with homicide at the moment, and we're very interested to see whether or not this might actually change because there's been a lot of media reporting, many of you are probably aware of it, of homicides that have occurred. So that would certainly be interesting, and we look forward to getting that data from the police. Most homicide victims are killed most often stabbed or beaten by someone known to them. I've got two things on this. First, the one here on the left is the primary relationship between victim and offender within an incident, and the next one is the method for which the person died or the victim died, the primary method. So what we have is 52% of homicides in the most recent year, so in the 2007 or 8, were actually homicides between domestic related people, so family members, people within a family relationship, cousins to cousins, fathers to children, husbands to wives, and so forth. 29% were acquaintances or friends, so in total you're looking at roughly 80% of all homicides that occurred in 2007 or 8 were actually between people who knew each other. So stranger homicides quite rare, only 11%, and 8% can't be classified because sometimes offenders aren't known. We do get homicides come through the system where an offender is not yet known, so they're not able to be classified in terms of that. And stabbings, of course, are the most prominent cause of death, 42% of homicides, followed by beatings at 23%. Only 11% of homicides in that year resulted from a gunshot wound, and that's, again, pretty much at a historical low in terms of the involvement of firearms in homicides, but I'll come to that in a moment. Not all types of homicides have declined. I mentioned earlier that we're at a historical low. But not every type of homicide has actually been going down, unfortunately. What we actually have is a decline in the homicides that occur between friends and acquaintances, as you can see by that graph although the colours aren't quite as easily identifiable. But the one that's running downwards with the trend line is actually acquaintance homicides. The one that's in effect a fairly straight line are our domestic homicides. So what we're seeing is the drive in homicide declines is predominantly being driven by friends and acquaintance homicides and not domestic homicides. It means that domestic homicides are just as frequent today as they were almost 10 years ago in terms of number, which of course is of great interest to policymakers in terms of that issue around intimate partner homicide and family homicide. And the other two are basically stable, with the exception of a few minor blips on the map, but otherwise no major change there. Alcohol is a common precipitating factor in homicidal encounters. Basically, this again is looking at whether or not the victim or the offender in an incident had been drinking alcohol or were known to be drinking alcohol prior to the incident. And indeed what we get, this is the distribution across the different types of homicide that I mentioned. 29% of domestic homicides the victim had been drinking, and 28% of domestic homicides the offender had been drinking. But interestingly enough, for stranger homicides, your potential brawls outside pubs and clubs or even on the street or in a park or whatever, 61% of offenders for homicides that involved only strangers had an offender who had actually been drinking prior to the incident, and 29% of victims in those situations had been drinking prior to the incident. There's a paper that the AIC released not long ago on alcohol and homicide, and I would certainly, for anyone who's interested in knowing rates and the nuances and differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous offenders and men and women and all of those kinds of things, I would certainly encourage you to take that paper or have a look at it, because it goes into far more detail than I have time to here. And finally, before I wrap up, I just wanted to say that there's always a question about how relevant is homicide in Australia. In 2007-08, there were 260. You compare that to America. Of course, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it pales into insignificance, the number of homicides that occur in America. Even, not just in terms of number, but in terms of the rate of homicide that occurs in America. So the question is, well, how relevant is it for the AIC to be monitoring homicides, and why are we actually doing it, or why should we be doing it? In 1996, after the Port Arthur massacre, in fact, John Howard, many of you know, who was elected and then came in effect with the National Firearms Agreement, which in effect was about buying back firearms in Australia. One of the key things about that was that homicide data and the relationship between gun-related homicides and the levels of gun-related homicides were used as one of those key indicators of the extent to which that policy might have or might not have had an impact in reducing firearm-related homicides. Certainly what we've shown is that firearm homicides are at an historical low. They've decreased almost quite significantly since 1996. However, there's a debate academically at the moment as to whether or not that decrease was as a result of that agreement or whether or not the decrease was already occurring prior to that agreement. And there are many papers written both by those who support gun laws and those who don't, who are gun owners, and various different arguments as to whether or not the policy had an effect. But nevertheless, the homicide data has been one of those key things that have been used as a way of trying to demonstrate that effect. And then similarly, after the Monash University shooting, there was the National Handgun Control Agreement that came out in 2002, and again, that was another opportunity to look at the extent to which handguns were involved as a proportion of firearm-related homicides. And what I can tell you in the new report that we'll be releasing is that handguns are, as a proportion of firearm homicides, at an historical low as well, which is interesting and of course good for Australia. And then finally, just to finish off, most recently there was a plan. It's called the Time for Action, the National Council's plan for Australia to reduce violence against women and their children. It's a 2009 to 2021 plan. And I don't need to say any more about it except that this is an opportunity really for Australia to start looking at the issues around violence against women and violence in the home. And the homicide data, in fact, is currently being used to look in more detail at intimate partner homicides. As Kelly mentioned in her presentation earlier, more detail on child homicides in situations in which children are killed. And similarly, a much larger study that the AIC is currently in the throes of undertaking, which is looking at domestic and family-related homicides in Indigenous communities, which Matthew may have mentioned earlier this morning. So the Homicide Database has become one of those really key fundamental data sets that we use to try and inform these policies in a really important way. And although the number of homicides is relatively low, it still, for lack of a better term, packs a punch when it comes to trying to give policymakers the information that they need to assess what's going on out there in Australia.